So welcome to the Creative Mornings stage, Jennifer.
Thank you for introducing me. I also identify myself as a creative community builder. My role at the Art Center is a community engagement specialist. I consider myself an artist. I'm a mom of 2 little girls, 6 and 3 years old. I'm an eater of good food, and I am a drinker of good beer and good wine. And so I imagine that you all can probably connect with those things a lot more than, than the other introductions. So I wanted to start off with that. My background is a little weird how I ended up where I am. I have my undergraduate in psychology and sociology. I did my master's in counseling. And so resiliency for me kind of first goes to that place, the psychology place. You'll see that a lot in the presentation today. And then I did 1 year of art school when I first graduated from high school. I loved it, but it was a very expensive program. So I opted for something different, and then somehow ended back up in this art world. And I could not be more grateful for the fact that I get to bring together the psychology piece, the art piece, and also the community piece in the work that I do. So let's see here. So I wanted to start off with asking you all what you think of when you think of resiliency, and not necessarily a definition of resiliency, but maybe a scenario or your own experience. And you can throw that in the chat if you want to share what comes to mind for you. What came to mind for me right away, and this comes back to when I did my graduate program in counseling. It was community counseling, and I ended up doing a internship with a community resident facility for teens. And so I think of resiliency, and I think of kids who have to overcome trauma and cycles of abuse and things like that, and how in that world of psychology, how that is measured, right? How they're looking at an individual's ability to be resilient. So that's what right away came to mind for me, which is why I went down kind of a rabbit hole of trying to think about resiliency outside of that, because it really is, applicable to so many different situations. So yes, okay, so managing challenges, perseverance, flexibility, and strength. Yes, all of these things. And I think, like, especially when we think about this past year of going through this crazy pandemic, a year and a half at this point, we can think probably of even some personal examples of how we've had to overcome really specific challenges that we never thought that we would have to encounter before. So that is where resiliency kind of comes in as well. So when we are no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. So Viktor Frankl is this amazing psychiatrist. He actually is a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And I thought that this quote kind of perfectly exemplified the heart of what resilience is, right? It's this idea of encountering changes and how we react to them and ultimately change because of them. So I wanted to tell you a couple of stories. A colleague of mine always reminds me that the best way to connect with people and catch your attention is by telling stories. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about Saddam the monkey. So Saddam the monkey, I was reading this book. It's called Creative Spark, and by this anthropologist who he believes that creativity and collaboration are at the heart of how humans have evolved to become who we are. And he tells this story, as an anthropologist, he would observe primates, right? That was kind of at the heart of his research. So he was in Bali, he was observing monkeys, and there's this monkey that the locals would call Saddam. And it's because this monkey was he was the alpha in his group, and he ruled with an iron fist. Like he was aggressive, he was mean, he would fight people off. You could actually tell the females that were part of the group because they were scratched up, had scars, had chunks of hair missing, because Saddam was just a terribly awful dictator, which is, you can understand why they started calling him Saddam. So Saddam one day fell and he broke his leg. And what happened was, he obviously couldn't be as aggressive. He couldn't as effectively fight or challenge people or other monkeys, right? And so these two younger male monkeys started realizing that they could take advantage of this moment. They could get creative with how they were going to step into this alpha role. So they started messing with Saddam, pushing him around a little bit, aligned themselves with the female alpha, and eventually Saddam lost his rank. He left the group, was no longer in his role. Saddam spent probably, I think it was 4 months solo, kind of did his thing for 4 months before he started aligning himself with another group of monkeys, first on kind of the periphery, but then he started, cozying up to some of the females. Hey, let me watch your kids for you. Let me groom you. And he eventually became a part of the group. He was embraced into the group, but he was this submissive monkey where whenever the dominant males would come around, he would shy away, so they would leave him alone. And he lived this very comfortable life where he got to mate with all the females. He got to, play with the kids. He got to do his thing. But he was, from an outside perspective, it's like he was a completely different monkey, right? Like he had changed entirely. But he was the same monkey. He had just become different because he had to, because he encountered challenges and had to shift who he was because of that. So that's my first story. The second story is about Mabel. And Mabel is, I wanted to tell you the first story as like a frame of reference, right? Because Mabel is a project of mine. It's the mobile art-based engagement lab that was built through the Creative Catalyst program, through the Mesa Art Center. But the story with Mabel is also one of resilience. And that's because Mabel, let me give you a little background on Creative Catalyst first. So Creative Catalyst is a program that was an idea 6 years ago, started in 2015, because the Arts Center received a grant from the Flynn Foundation, and it was based really just off of one question: what makes a community creative? And so when they got the grant, they asked me to be the coordinator on it, and I took that opportunity to really go out and have these kind of community gathering moments where anybody could come, and we would just have this very vague conversation about what makes a community creative. And as you can imagine, some people feel very uncomfortable with a lack of structure. I'm not one of those people. I like to have this like freedom to play and think about things in different ways. And so that's what I did. I created these spaces that it made people uncomfortable, but it also allowed them to not have any boundaries around what they were thinking about when it came to what made their community creative. And so over the years, we ended up identifying a lot of different programming that the community wanted to do and try. And so we did that. We tried a lot of things. We failed at a lot of things. We adjusted at a lot of things. We retired programs when they didn't work anymore. And at the end of it, I guess not at the end of it, but where we are now, we have identified a number of programs that are kind of staple programs of what Creative Catalyst is. And one of the wonderful things about the story of Creative Catalyst is that it started as a grant. We got a follow-up grant from Flynn, but what happened was the Art Center saw value in community-driven programming, which is what we were doing. All of our programming was driven by community conversations and what the community wanted to see. And so they brought me on as staff, and now I'm a full-time staff member of the Art Center, and I do this stuff as my full-time job, which kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Because like it's the whole job is made up. We're kind of changing things constantly. It's very responsive. But Mabel was a project that was thought of probably 4 years ago by a group of community members, probably 25 people who got together and said, we want an opportunity to take arts engagement experiences out into the community and do these things not at the Arts Center campus and not necessarily just in downtown, but we want to be able to create a space and an experience in neighborhoods, in parks, wherever we want to take it, where people are, instead of always expecting people to come to the Arts Center to experience these things. So we came up with this mobile art-based engagement lab, and there was a group of us. We put together a presentation. We went to the Arts Center leadership, and we said, we want to create this program, this Mabel, this trailer that we wanted to pull into different spaces. And the initial response, I mean, it wasn't a flat out no, but it was essentially a no, now's not the time. Funding's, a little tight, like it's probably not going to happen. So, so we put it on a shelf. A handful of years later, decided we've got enough funding left. We've developed a really thoughtful budget. we want to ask again if we can do this. So we did. We went and we asked again, kind of a complicated conversation, but what if we did it bigger? But what if it was this? What if it, and eventually we got to a really wonderful compromise of like, okay, you can do it on this tiny budget that we have, you can pull it together. So we got approval, and it's a long process. Mesa Art Center is part of a city. Cities don't like to do things quickly. It took a long time, but we finally got this thing built. And ironically, it was kind of right when the pandemic hit that this thing was finished and ready to start being active in the community. So we had to put Mabel, I mean, it was in my driveway for several months, ended up in a parking lot for a handful of months. And we finally, in October of 2020, had realized that Mabel sitting in a parking lot wasn't doing the community any favors, that we really saw an opportunity to still serve the community, but we needed to do it a little bit differently, because the original idea of bringing people together to make art, to be creative together, that wasn't going to happen. Like, we're still all really conscious of coronavirus and wanting to be thoughtful. And it's not just about sanitizing your hands and your materials and wearing a mask. It's also about like being away from people, right? And so we couldn't bring people together. So we had to adjust. We ended up making art kits for people and distributing them at the farmers market initially, and it was great. It wasn't what we had originally planned, but we had to adapt and we had to change. And we ended up, at this point, we've distributed over 3,000 art kits to the community. There's been over 30 different projects that we've developed as part of it. We've worked with over 10 partners to create programming. This one over here is this young lady that was at a Parks and Rec event where it was celebrating Earth Month, and we did nature journals. These were two projects we developed in response to Asian American Pacific and Islander Month, doing a lunar calendar, and Jewish American Heritage Month, doing candle braiding and doing education around it. Dia de los Muertos, which is a huge event here in Mesa, and probably the Valley, now that I think about it. But we had to adapt and we had to change. And now here we are, where we're kind of feeling like we're coming out of the pandemic, and we can start imagining what it looks like to make art together again. So Mabel is again changing. And so in September of this year, we plan on completely shifting away from kits and beginning to have these moments of connecting with community by making art together again. So that is the story of Mabel. So I think that I wanted to tell these stories because I wanted to provide like these examples of how resiliency looks different in different ways, right? In different places, in different scenarios. But at the end of it, it requires change and it requires adaptation. And so I wanted to ask the question, and this is another part where you all can participate. Why do people change? And I understand that this is a really philosophical question that can take us down all kinds of roads of like philosophizing about why people change and how it happens, because there's probably people out there who decide that people can change, or they only change if they have to. But it's a question that was asked to me at one point in time, that I was forced to answer. Right, we were in a classroom. Every single person had to answer this question. It was like the first day of a class, so we had no context for understanding how we were supposed to answer the question. It was simply, okay, what do you think? How do you answer this question? So I wanted to put that out to all of you to think about. If you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat, I would love to hear what you think. But what I determined at the time was that people change because they're uncomfortable. That if you're comfortable, if you're in a space where everything's, you're living your life and everything feels good and cozy, then why change? But if you're uncomfortable, that's when those moments of change will happen. And that's kind of, ties back to that idea of resiliency, because it's in moments of challenges that we have to make changes, right? Yeah, necessity, something feeling out of place. When you're feeling challenged or squeezed, those are those moments where we have no choice. We have to change. So like I said, resilience looks different for different people. And I think that as I was going down this road, I was realizing that I'm going to use the pandemic as an example again, because you might see a person who comes out of the pandemic and they came out, they never lost their job. They still have the same job that they had. They're doing great in that job, and their home's intact, their family's intact. They survived, right? And that can be considered resilience. Alternatively, someone who went through the pandemic, lost their job, but then had to get creative, build a new business, was incredibly successful and happy with this new thing that they had to do. That's also resilience, right? So resilience is subjective, and it's situational. It really just depends on the person. So, like I said, defining it can be really simple. It's what we've been talking about. It's bouncing back from challenges by adapting to change. But when we dig deeper, there's so much more there, right? It's about awareness and mindfulness. It's about creative problem solving. It is about community and social connectedness. It's about optimism and self-advocacy. The idea that we are in charge of our choices and what happens to us, rather than some outside source, right? Intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. So resilience is more complex than just we're changing because things were hard. There's so many other elements at play here, which means that there's a lot of these characteristics that already exist inside of us. And it's kind of tapping into those and realizing that these are things that we can exercise to build our resiliency. One of the biggest things is creativity. So just like with creativity, resiliency is a skill that has to be built and developed. So in our creative leadership program, The Collective, that's really the foundation of that entire program. We developed it 3 years ago. We're about to graduate our third class. I saw a couple of the alumni popped on here. I hope they're still here. But that whole program was developed because we saw a need to really put creativity at the foundation of professional development and leadership building, because it's important, right? Our ability as humans to be creative and to be responsive and to adapt, super important just in life, but it's also important in professional experiences. And as we see our society evolved and our economy evolve, we see that there's an automation happening. There's this human component, this creativity, this ability to adapt, that is one of the only things that we haven't really seen replicated yet, right? AI is a thing, but AI can't be as creative as we can. And that's really important. And so that's why we built this collective program. And so when I started looking at resiliency, I started kind of interchanging the words, because in a lot of ways, they're one and the same. They're kind of two peas in that same pod. It's this ability to adapt and change. Creativity is the ability to adapt and change. So that's really at the foundation of the conversation about resiliency. So how do you build this skill? So it turns out that there is research that indicates that we can build resiliency through creative practice. So everyone on here, I don't know all of you, but I imagine if you're at a Creative Mornings talk, you're probably connecting with creativity to some degree, right? And so lucky us, creative practice is at the heart of building our own resiliency. So number one is to keep being creative. And so creativity it's one of 24 character strengths that were identified in the field of positive psychology. It's across cultures, across the globe. It's seen as this sought after and encouraged characteristic. So being creative, it enhances our ability to connect abstract ideas, to think abstractly, to come up with novel solutions. And really that, whether it's us with a painting hobby, or us, practicing photography or performing, whatever that creative outlet is for us, we're already probably more resilient than the person who doesn't do that, right? Because that's building all of these skills inherently just by practicing it. The next thing is breaking some rules. This is kind of my thing. I think that this is such an important part of being creative, and it's also an important part of resiliency, because it's about taking risks, and it's about learning from failure. And it's about understanding. It's like a shift in your mind and your perspective. It's understanding that a lot of the rules that we follow every day without really thinking about it were created at some point by some dude, probably a long time ago, who decided this was a rule and we should all follow it. And so, like, better stay in line. And now here we are years later, and we're just doing it because that's what we were taught. But in reality, there's a lot of rules that have been developed that don't work anymore, or they're no longer as functional as they once were. And so the idea of challenging rules, or challenging, like preconceived or predetermined ideas that we all kind of just fall in line with, I think is so exciting. It's this really beautiful opportunity for us to challenge the things that aren't working anymore. So the other part is community, and these are all going to come together, right? So connect with your community, which I kind of mentioned, but resilience and creativity, they're not things that are going to happen in isolation. They're just as essential to building the inner psychological skills is the building of your outer community, right? So the fact that resilience can be cultivated through our everyday actions. We can approach any inevitable challenge in work and life with more creative outlook. It's curiosity, experimentation. It's reimagining the possibilities. And hopefully, as we have experienced a global shutdown and come out of it, it's exposed a lot of those poorly designed systems, those poorly designed rules that don't work anymore, and put us in a place where we can collectively like reimagine and help us like redesign what happens next. And that's also part of resiliency, because this experience made us realize what didn't work and forces us to change, right? And then the last thing on here, I put building awareness, because while I was talking to my husband about this, and I was like, when people change because they're uncomfortable, he was like, yeah, but they also have to be aware. It's like, that's a really good point. Awareness is a super important part of that process. And building awareness through mindfulness and creativity is, I think, something that makes it more accessible for those of us who naturally gravitate towards a creative lens. So mindfulness, when I think about it, and this is a part of our collective programming as well, I think that there's probably a universal definition of mindfulness for sure, right? Like, it's being present in the moment, it's practicing meditation. There's a lot of pieces of mindfulness. When I think of mindfulness, I honestly, like, my most important lesson learned there is that ability to be present in the moment and to increase my own awareness and understanding of a situation like in that moment, right? And so that's what I mean by this. And one of the strategies that I like to talk about is the idea of like a purposeful pause, which is not meditation. It's really just those moments where we realize our minds are racing a mile a minute. We're not really present, right? And like, we could even use right now as an example, right? So we're here, we're in this space, but we probably have 400 other things going on in our lives that we're thinking about. I've got 2 screens open, right? Like, I could have a third and be thinking about something else. I could have my email, like I've got my phone going on. When we have those moments where we realize that we're not fully engaged in the one thing, but we're actually spreading our brain to 17 different activities, which could be like tabs in an internet browser, right? Like 7, which is my downfall for sure. It's allowing ourselves to have that purposeful pause to bring ourselves back to that current moment. One of the ways that I learned to do this a long time ago was by legit closing my eyes and counting off 5 things that I can hear, 5 things that I can feel, and just like allowing myself to reconnect with what's happening in that current space. So, but awareness is one of those key elements to building resilience as well. So how can we overcome challenges if we aren't paying attention to why they are challenging us? All right, so this kind of wraps up what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to end with this quote. So this is the author of the book about Saddam the monkey. So we're coming full circle here. Our lineage survived while all other human species went extinct because our ancestors used their creative capacity to reshape the threats and opportunities of their environments, and in turn reshaping themselves, which is kind of amazing if we think about it, right? This idea that we as humans evolved to the place that we are because we were able to be creative. And another one of his key pieces was collaborative. So connecting with people and being creative is what made us evolve into the exceptional human species that we are. So last, I'm going to wrap it up with a quick additional piece. So creative resilience is the capacity to generate and act on positive solutions under the pressure of challenge and change. It's reimagining our environment, shifting our perspective to new possibilities, even when our fight or flight response is kicked into high gear. It may just be the key to human success as a species. So that is it. And for those who are curious about resources, I did put them here because that is my psychology background. It took a lot for me not to put them in APA format, but there they are. And I threw my brain at the bottom there because that was an important part of it with my email address if you would like to have it and connect with me. But that is it. That's all I got on resiliency. There's probably more, but I'm going to end it there.